It was a sunny afternoon in the bustling city of Evergreen Heights. People hurried through the crowded streets, each caught up in their own little worlds. Amid the chatter and hum of daily life, a quiet figure sat near the park entrance. Jacob, a kind-hearted man in his mid-30s, had learned to adapt to life in a wheelchair. Despite the challenges, he carried an air of warmth and patience that drew people to him. Every day he rolled to the park, enjoying the sights and sounds of the world around him, content in his own way. On this particular day, a gleaming black luxury car pulled up to the cafe across the street. The door opened, and out stepped Clarissa, a striking woman known for her sharp fashion sense and even sharper tongue. Clarissa came from a wealthy family and had spent most of her life getting exactly what she wanted. Her designer outfit, towering heels, and perfectly styled hair drew attention. But it was her attitude that always left a lasting impression. She had a reputation for looking down on others, especially those she believed were beneath her. As Clarissa strutted toward the cafe, heads turned, though not always in admiration. Her loud voice carried through the air as she barked orders into her phone, complaining about the tiniest inconveniences. She pushed her way past the line of customers waiting to be seated, not sparing a single glance at the frustrated faces she left in her wake. Jacob happened to be nearby, enjoying a coffee and quietly reading a book. He glanced up briefly, noticing the commotion Clarissa caused, but quickly returned to his reading. He wasn't one to judge people by their outward behavior, but today would test even his patience. Clarissa's sharp eyes landed on Jacob as she walked out of the cafe with her drink. Something about his calm demeanor seemed to irritate her. Perhaps it was the ease with which he ignored the world's chaos or the quiet confidence he exuded despite his circumstances. Whatever it was, Clarissa decided she didn't like it. She sauntered over, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. Well, she said with a smirk, her voice dripping with condescension. Must be nice, just sitting around all day doing nothing. Jacob looked up, startled. For a moment, he wasn't sure if she was talking to him. But the way her gaze lingered told him otherwise. "Excuse me," he asked politely, though there was a hint of confusion in his tone. "You heard me," Clarissa replied, crossing her arms. "Some of us actually work hard to get where we are. Not everyone has the luxury of lounging in a park all day." Several people nearby turned their heads, shocked by her words. Jacob could feel the weight of their stares, but he kept his composure. "I'm not sure what I did to upset you," he said calmly, "but I don't think judging someone without knowing their story is the best approach." Clarissa scoffed. "Story? Please, let me guess. You're another one of those life-gave-me-lemons types who expects the world to feel sorry for you." She took a sip of her overpriced latte, her expression smug. Jacob's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of something unshakable in them. "You might be surprised," he said quietly. "Life has a way of humbling us when we least expect it." For a moment, Clarissa hesitated. There was something in Jacob's voice that made her pause, a depth she hadn't anticipated. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. She tossed her hair and laughed dismissively. "Humility is for people who can't afford confidence," she said, turning to walk away. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the street. Clarissa froze, her face paling as she realized what had happened. People gasped, and the crowd began to gather. Jacob looked on, his expression unreadable, as the scene unfolded before them. Clarissa had no idea that her world was about to change forever. The street was alive with a mixture of shock and curiosity. People craned their necks to see what had caused the commotion. Clarissa turned around, her confidence suddenly replaced by unease. The crash had come from her luxury car, now surrounded by a small crowd. She marched over, her heels clicking on the pavement, her latte forgotten in her hand. As Clarissa pushed her way through the gathering onlookers, her perfectly composed facade began to crack. Her precious car, the one she flaunted as a symbol of her success, was no longer the pristine vehicle she parked just minutes ago. A delivery truck, attempting to squeeze into a narrow space, had accidentally scraped the side, leaving a long, jagged dent. "Are you kidding me?" Clarissa's voice rose sharply, drawing even more attention. Do you have any idea how much this car costs? The delivery driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, stepped out nervously. I'm so sorry, ma'am, he said, his voice filled with regret. I didn't see the edge of your car. I'll take full responsibility. Responsibility? Clarissa scoffed, her eyes narrowing. Do you think that's going to fix this? Do you even have the money to cover the damages? This is a limited edition car, not some junk on wheels like what we're driving. The man looked down, his shoulders slumping. The crowd murmured, their expressions ranging from sympathy for the driver to disapproval of Clarissa's outburst. Jacob, still seated by the park entrance, watched silently. He could see the panic and embarrassment on the driver's face, and it stirred something in him. Clarissa continued her tirade, her voice growing louder. This is why people like you shouldn't be allowed near decent neighborhoods. You're careless and... Enough. Jacob's calm but firm voice cut through the air. Clarissa turned abruptly, her fiery glare landing on him. Excuse me, she snapped. I said, that's enough, Jacob repeated, wheeling himself closer. He's apologized and admitted his mistake. There's no need to humiliate him further. Clarissa's eyes narrowed. And what gives you the right to tell me what to do? Oh, wait, let me guess. You're going to lecture me about kindness and compassion. Spare me. Jacob met her gaze steadily. Kindness isn't about lectures. It's about actions. Something to think about. The crowd seemed to shift in Jacob's favor, a few nodding in agreement. Clarissa, however, wasn't about to back down. You know, for someone who's stuck in a wheelchair, you sure act high and mighty, she sneered. There was a collective gasp from the bystanders. Even Clarissa seemed momentarily shocked by her own words, but she quickly masked it with a defiant look. Jacob didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both understanding and an unshakable strength. I've learned that what you say about others often says more about you, he replied gently. Clarissa's cheeks flushed, but before she could respond, the delivery driver stepped forward. Look, ma'am, I really am sorry. I'll call my insurance company and... Don't bother, Clarissa snapped. This is going to cost more than your insurance could ever cover. The tension in the air was thick. Jacob could see the driver's hands trembling as he fumbled for his phone. The man was clearly overwhelmed, and Jacob couldn't stand by any longer. Maybe I can help, Jacob offered, his voice steady. Clarissa rolled her eyes. Help? And how exactly do you plan to do that? Jacob ignored her tone and turned to the driver. Sometimes things happen that are out of our control. Let's figure this out together. The driver looked at Jacob with gratitude, while Clarissa let out a derisive laugh. This is ridiculous. You can't fix this. And frankly, it's not your problem. Maybe not, Jacob replied, looking directly at her. But I've learned that helping someone else often helps you too. Clarissa stared at him, confused and annoyed by his calm demeanor. She didn't understand how someone like him, someone she deemed insignificant, could stand up to her so effortlessly. The crowd began to disperse, their interest waning now that the confrontation seemed to be losing steam. The delivery driver, still shaken, exchanged numbers with Clarissa under Jacob's watchful eye. Despite her protests, she eventually agreed to let the insurance process play out. As the driver left, muttering another apology, Clarissa turned back to Jacob. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Jacob shook his head. Not at all. I'm just someone who believes in second chances. Clarissa frowned, his words gnawing at her in a way she couldn't quite explain. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a small child ran up to Jacob, clutching a drawing. Mr. Jacob, I made this for you, the child exclaimed, holding up a colorful picture of a man in a wheelchair surrounded by flowers. Jacob's face lit up with a genuine smile. Thank you, Lily. It's beautiful. Clarissa watched the interaction, her expression unreadable. Something about the way the child looked at Jacob, with pure admiration and joy, left her momentarily speechless. As the child ran back to her mother, Jacob glanced at Clarissa. It's amazing how much kindness can change the way people see you, he said softly. Clarissa didn't respond. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of doubt about her own actions, but her pride wouldn't let her show it. She turned abruptly, walking away without another word. Jacob watched her go, a thoughtful look on his face. He didn't know what had led Clarissa to become the way she was, but he had a feeling that their paths would cross again. And when they did, he hoped she might see the world, and herself, in a different light. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as the city moved on, oblivious to the small but significant moments unfolding in its midst. For Jacob, it was just another day. But for Clarissa, it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. A journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. The days that followed were ordinary for Jacob, but the encounter with Clarissa lingered in his mind. He didn't dwell on her insults. They were just words, after all. But there was something about the way she carried herself, so guarded and defensive, that intrigued him. He'd met plenty of people in his life who masked their pain with arrogance, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was one of them. Meanwhile, Clarissa went about her life as if nothing had happened, but she couldn't completely shake the memory of that afternoon. She told herself Jacob was just another overly optimistic person trying to sound wise, but his words kept replaying in her head. She hated how calm and collected he'd been, as though her barbs had no effect on him. It was unsettling. At work, Clarissa's irritation showed. She snapped at her assistant for bringing her the wrong coffee and criticized her team during a meeting, leaving the room tense and quiet. Usually, her sharp demeanor was seen as a sign of her high standards, but lately it had started to alienate those around her. That evening, Clarissa sat in her luxurious apartment, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. Her social media feed was filled with carefully curated images of her success, lavish vacations, expensive dinners, and designer outfits. To anyone else, her life looked perfect. But for the first time, she felt a twinge of emptiness as she scrolled past the smiling faces of people she barely knew anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification. A friend had tagged her in a video. Someone had filmed part of her confrontation with Jacob and posted it online. The caption read, "When arrogance meets kindness." The clip had already garnered thousands of views and comments, many of them harshly critical of her behavior. Clarissa's face burned as she read the comments. Wow, what a piece of work. Some people really need a lesson in humility. Big respect to the guy in the wheelchair for staying so calm. She slammed her phone down furious. How dare they judge her? They didn't know her life, her struggles. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that they weren't entirely wrong. The next morning, Clarissa decided to distract herself by heading back to the cafe near the park. She told herself it was just for the coffee, but part of her wondered if she'd see Jacob again. She convinced herself she didn't care. But the truth was, she felt a strange pull toward him. Perhaps because he hadn't reacted to her the way most people did. When she arrived, she spotted him almost immediately. He was sitting at the same spot, chatting with a young man who looked to be a college student. The two of them laughed over something, their conversation easy and light. Clarissa hesitated. For a moment, she considered turning around and leaving, but her pride wouldn't let her retreat. She walked toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. When Jacob noticed her, his expression didn't change. If he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. "Back to dispense more wisdom?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm, though it lacked the sharpness it had before. Jacob smiled faintly. "Just enjoying the morning," he said. "What about you?" Clarissa shrugged, sitting down at a nearby table without being invited. "I needed coffee." The college student excused himself politely, sensing the tension. Jacob watched him go before turning his attention back to Clarissa. "It's good to see you again," he said, his tone genuine. Clarissa raised an eyebrow. "Really? After what I said the other day?" "People say things they don't mean when they're upset," Jacob replied. "It doesn't define who they are." Clarissa stared at him, caught off guard by his response. She expected anger, or at least sarcasm, but his kindness was disarming. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply sipped her coffee in silence. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city filled the space between them. Cars honking, children laughing, birds chirping. Finally, Clarissa broke the silence. "Why are you like this?" she asked abruptly. "Like what?" Jacob asked, genuinely curious. "So unbothered. Don't you ever get angry? Don't you ever feel like lashing out?" Jacob considered her question for a moment. "I used to," he admitted. "There was a time when I let my frustrations get the best of me. But I learned that anger doesn't change anything. It just keeps you stuck." Clarissa frowned, his words hitting closer to home than she wanted to admit. "That sounds nice in theory," she said, "but it's not so easy in real life." "No, it's not," Jacob agreed. "But it's worth trying. Life has a way of teaching you that." Clarissa opened her mouth to respond, but she was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Jacob." A middle-aged woman approached, pushing a stroller with a sleeping baby inside. Her face lit up when she saw Jacob, and he greeted her warmly. "Maria, it's good to see you," he said. "How's little Emma?" "Growing too fast," Maria said with a laugh. She glanced at Clarissa, her smile faltering slightly. "Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all," Jacob said. "Maria, this is Clarissa. Clarissa, this is Maria, one of my oldest friends." Maria nodded politely, though her expression held a hint of caution. "Nice to meet you," she said. Clarissa muttered a quick greeting, feeling strangely out of place. Maria didn't linger, sensing the tension, and soon left with a wave. Clarissa turned back to Jacob, her defenses rising again. "You've got quite the fan club," she said, her tone light, but tinged with envy. Jacob chuckled. "Not a fan club, just friends." Clarissa looked away, the word friends sticking in her mind. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a genuine connection with someone. Her relationships were transactional, built on networking and appearances. For a brief moment, she considered opening up, sharing something real about herself. But the thought terrified her. Instead, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the pavement. "Anyway, I should go," she said, her voice brisk. "Thanks for the chat." Jacob nodded, his gaze steady. "Take care, Clarissa." As she walked away, Clarissa couldn't shake the feeling that she was running from something she wasn't ready to face. Jacob watched her go, a thoughtful expression on his face. He didn't know her full story, but he could see the cracks beneath her polished surface. And he had a feeling that those cracks were only the beginning. Days turned into weeks, but Clarissa couldn't seem to shake the nagging feeling that had taken root inside her since that day at the park. She buried herself in work, trying to drown out the unease by focusing on deals and deadlines. But no matter how hard she tried, Jacob's calm words and unshakable demeanor lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just what he had said, it was how he had said it. He had looked at her like he could see straight through her defenses, and she hated how exposed it made her feel. One evening, as she sat in her office, long after everyone else had gone home, Clarissa found herself scrolling through the comments on that viral video again. Her finger hovered over one particular comment. Asterisk people like her think they're untouchable until life reminds them they're not. Asterisk, she closed her laptop with a snap, her jaw tightening. She wasn't sure if it was anger or something else that made her chest feel so tight. The next day, Clarissa found herself back at the cafe near the park. She didn't even try to justify it this time. She scanned the area, her eyes landing on Jacob, who was talking to an elderly man with a scruffy dog. She hesitated, debating whether to approach him, but before she could decide, the elderly man patted Jacob on the shoulder and walked away, leaving him alone. Clarissa took a deep breath and walked over, her heels clicking against the pavement. Jacob looked up as she approached, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Back again?" he asked, his tone light. "I guess so," she said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. She stared at him for a moment, trying to find the right words. "You're always here," she finally said, though it came out more like an accusation than she intended. I like this spot, Jacob said simply. It's peaceful. Peaceful, Clarissa repeated, almost scoffing. I don't think I felt that in years. Jacob tilted his head slightly, studying her. Maybe you've been looking for it in the wrong places. Clarissa let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. And where exactly am I supposed to look? In a park, talking to strangers. Sometimes, yes, Jacob said, but mostly it's about looking inward. Clarissa rolled her eyes. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Jacob admitted, but it's worth it. For a moment, they sat in silence. The sounds of the parks seemed to fill the space between them. Children laughing, leaves rustling in the breeze, a dog barking in the distance. Clarissa glanced at Jacob, her expression softening just slightly. Why do you even care? She asked quietly. You don't know me. Jacob smiled faintly. Because everyone deserves a little kindness, even if they don't think they do. Clarissa looked away, his words striking a chord she didn't want to acknowledge. Before she could respond, a commotion broke out across the street. A young boy had run into the road, chasing after a ball, and a car screeched to a halt just inches from him. The boy froze, his face pale with fear, and his mother screamed as she rushed toward him. Jacob instinctively wheeled himself closer, but the boy's mother reached in first, scooping him up and holding him tightly. The driver got out of the car, apologizing profusely, and the situation seemed to calm down quickly. But Clarissa couldn't take her eyes off the scene. She felt her chest tighten as she watched the mother hug her son, tears streaming down her face. Something about it hit her harder than she expected. Memories she had buried deep began to surface, unbidden and unwelcome. Without thinking, she stood up abruptly. I have to go, she said, her voice shaky. Jacob looked up at her, his brow furrowing. Clarissa. But she was already walking away, her steps quick and unsteady. She didn't stop until she was far from the park, her breathing heavy and her heart pounding. She leaned against the lamppost, closing her eyes and trying to push the memories back down where they belonged. For the rest of the day, she couldn't focus. The image of the mother and child, the fear and relief on their faces, played over and over in her mind. It reminded her of a time she had tried so hard to forget. A time when she had been vulnerable and powerless, just like that little boy. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Clarissa picked up her phone and stared at it for a long time. Finally, she opened her messaging app and typed out a quick message to a number she hadn't used in years. Asterisk, I'm sorry. I know it's been a long time, but I'd like to talk if you're open to it. Asterisk. She hesitated for a moment before hitting send. She didn't know if the message would even reach them, but something inside her told her she had to try. The next morning, she found herself back at the park. She didn't know why. Maybe it was because she couldn't stop thinking about Jacob, or maybe it was because she was tired of running from herself. When she spotted Jacob, she approached him hesitantly. He looked up, surprised to see her so soon. Back again? He asked, his tone light but curious. Clarissa nodded, sitting down across from him. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a voice softer than he had ever heard from her, she said, How do you do it? How do you deal with everything? Jacob's expression softened. By taking it one day at a time, he said, and by remembering that even the worst days don't last forever. Clarissa looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. What if you've made mistakes you can't fix? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Then you start by forgiving yourself, he said. And you do the best you can from this point forward. Clarissa swallowed hard, his words hitting her like a punch to the gut. She didn't respond. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, like maybe, just maybe, change was possible. As they sat in the park, the city buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet but profound shift taking place in one woman's heart. The park began to empty as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. Clarissa remained seated across from Jacob, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite pin down. For the first time in years, she felt a small crack in the walls she had built around herself, but it was unsettling. She didn't know if she was ready to let them fall. Jacob, ever patient, sat quietly, letting her wrestle with her thoughts. It was as though he instinctively understood that pushing her wouldn't help. But before Clarissa could gather the courage to speak again, a voice called out from behind them. "Jacob, you're a hard man to find these days." Both Clarissa and Jacob turned toward the voice. A man in his late 30s, dressed in casual but slightly worn clothes, approached with a confident stride. His face was familiar enough to make Clarissa pause, but she couldn't quite place him. Jacob's expression, however, shifted ever so slightly. "Adam," Jacob said, his tone neutral, but edged with something Clarissa couldn't quite identify. Adam stopped a few feet away, giving Jacob a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You're looking good. Still holding court in the park, I see." Jacob didn't respond immediately, his calm demeanor unshaken. "What brings you here?" he asked evenly. "Oh, I was just passing through," Adam said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He glanced at Clarissa, his gaze lingering for a moment. "Friend of yours?" Before Jacob could answer, Clarissa spoke up. "Clarissa," she said, extending her hand out of habit. Adam shook her hand briefly, his smile returning. "Adam, nice to meet you." The interaction felt off, and Clarissa couldn't ignore the tension that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. She looked between the two men, her curiosity piqued. "Well," Adam continued, his attention back on Jacob, "I was hoping we could talk. It's been a while, and there are some things we should clear up." Jacob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. "Sure, let's talk." Clarissa stood, sensing that this wasn't a conversation she was meant to be part of. "I should get going anyway," she said, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. Jacob looked up at her, his expression softening. "Thanks for stopping by," he said. Clarissa hesitated, her instincts telling her there was more to this encounter than met the eye. But she forced herself to smile and walk away, though she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder as she left. As she walked back toward the street, her thoughts swirled. Who was Adam? And why had Jacob's usually unshakable calm seemed to falter, even if only slightly? She told herself it wasn't her business, but something about the interaction gnawed at her. Later that evening, as Clarissa sat in her apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd witnessed. She searched for distractions, emails, social media, even an old movie, but nothing worked. Finally, she found herself searching for Jacob's name online. At first, nothing came up. But as she scrolled further, a news article from years ago caught her attention. The headline made her heart skip a beat. Asterisk local man involved in fraud scandal speaks out. I was set up. Asterisk. The man in the photo accompanying the article was unmistakably Jacob. His face was younger, free of the lines that hinted at the hardships he'd endured, but his piercing gaze was the same. Clarissa clicked on the article, her pulse quickening as she read. The story detailed allegations against Jacob and his former business partner, Adam. The two had been accused of embezzling funds from a non-profit organization they had co-founded to help underprivileged communities. Jacob had maintained his innocence, claiming that Adam had orchestrated the entire scheme and left him to take the fall. But with no hard evidence to clear his name, Jacob had been forced to step away from the organization, his reputation in tatters. Clarissa leaned back in her chair, the pieces beginning to click into place. She realized now why Jacob had seemed so guarded when Adam appeared. Whatever had happened between them, it was far from resolved. The next morning, Clarissa found herself back at the park, once again a resolve firm. She didn't know why she felt so invested in Jacob's story, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward uncovering the truth. When she arrived, she found Jacob sitting alone, his usual calm exterior back in place. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," Clarissa said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. Jacob nodded, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "Morning." I saw Adam yesterday, she began carefully. He seemed interesting. Jacob's gaze met hers, steady but guarded. That's one way to put it. Clarissa hesitated, then decided to take the plunge. I looked you up, she admitted. I read about what happened with the non-profit. For a moment, Jacob said nothing. Then he let out a quiet sigh. I figured you might, he said. People usually do once they get curious enough. Clarissa leaned forward slightly, her curiosity burning. Is it true, what they said about you? Jacob's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, in his eyes. What do you think? He asked. Clarissa hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I don't know, she admitted, but I want to hear your side. Jacob studied her for a long moment before speaking. Adam and I started that non-profit because we wanted to make a difference, he said quietly. But somewhere along the way, things changed. He started cutting corners, making deals that didn't sit right with me. When I confronted him, he turned it around on me, made it look like I was the one at fault. He paused, his gaze distant. I lost everything, my reputation, my career. I thought about fighting back, but I realized it wasn't worth it, so I walked away. Clarissa felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. She could see the weight of the years in Jacob's eyes, the quiet strength it must have taken to keep going. Before she could respond, Jacob's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. It's Adam, he said, his voice tight. Clarissa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what was about to happen, but she could feel the tension in the air, thick and unrelenting. Whatever Adam wanted, it wasn't going to be simple. Jacob stared at his phone for a long moment, the tension in his face unmissable. Clarissa could feel her pulse quickening as she watched him, unsure of what he was about to do. Without saying a word, he accepted the call and pressed the phone to his ear. Adam, Jacob said, his voice steady, but edged with something sharper. Clarissa couldn't hear what Adam was saying on the other end, but she could tell from Jacob's expression that it wasn't good. His jaw tightened, his grip on the phone firm. Fine, Jacob said after a moment. I'll meet you. He ended the call and set the phone down on the table, exhaling deeply. What does he want? Clarissa asked, unable to hide her concern. Jacob looked at her, his eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability before he masked it with his usual calm. He says he has something to show me, he said. Something that will clear the air. Clarissa frowned. Do you believe him? Jacob shook his head, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not for a second, but I need to know what he's up to. Clarissa hesitated, then said, I'll go with you. Jacob looked surprised, but didn't argue. Are you sure? He asked. She nodded. If he's as slippery as you say, you shouldn't go alone. A few hours later, they found themselves in a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city. Adam was already there, seated in a booth near the back. He smiled as they approached, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. Jacob, Adam said, gesturing for them to sit. And you brought a friend. How charming. Clarissa bristled at his tone, but said nothing. Jacob slid into the booth across from Adam, and Clarissa sat beside him, her arms crossed. What do you want, Adam? Jacob asked, his voice cool. Adam leaned back, his grin widening. Always so direct. Fine, I'll get to the point. I have something that might interest you. He reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the table to Jacob. Clarissa leaned closer, her curiosity piqued. Jacob picked up the papers and began to read, his expression hardening with each passing second. Clarissa could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip on the papers tightened. What is this? Jacob demanded, his voice low. Adam's grin didn't waver. Proof, he said. Proof that I wasn't the only one cutting corners back then. Clarissa's stomach dropped as she realized what Adam was implying. She looked at Jacob, searching his face for any sign of guilt or denial. But Jacob didn't flinch. Instead, he tossed the papers back onto the table and leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You're lying," he said. Adam's grin faltered for the first time. "Am I?" he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Jacob reached into his own bag and pulled out a small folder, sliding it across the table to Adam. "Your signature," Jacob said, "on every deal you made behind my back. I kept these for years, thinking I might need them someday. Looks like I was right." Adam's face paled as he opened the folder and saw the documents inside. Clarissa watched as his confidence crumbled, replaced by anger and panic. "You set me up," Adam said, his voice rising. "No," Jacob said calmly. "You set yourself up. I just didn't let you get away with it completely." For a moment, the cafe was silent except for the faint hum of conversation from other patrons. Clarissa could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Adam finally shoved the folder back toward Jacob, his hands trembling. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's expression softened, but there was still steel in his eyes. "I want you to come clean," he said. "Not for me, but for the people we hurt. They deserve to know the truth." Adam stared at him, his jaw working as he struggled to find a response. Finally he nodded, though it was clear the decision was far from easy. Jacob leaned back, exhaling deeply. Clarissa reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support. As they left the cafe, the tension between them eased. Jacob looked at Clarissa, his expression a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," he said simply. Clarissa smiled. "You didn't need me in there," she said. "You had everything under control." "Maybe," Jacob said, "but it helped to have someone by my side." They walked back to the park, the sun dipping low on the horizon. For the first time in years, Jacob felt a sense of closure, while Clarissa felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. But as they sat down on their usual bench, a shadow fell over them. Clarissa looked up, her smile fading as she saw a figure approaching. It was a woman she recognized instantly, someone from her past she had hoped never to see again. "Clarissa," the woman said, her voice cold. "We need to talk." And just like that, the peace they had found was shattered, replaced by a new storm neither of them saw coming.